Kevin, welcome to the Archispeak podcast. Great to have you.
Thank you.
We are going to be talking about continuing education, which might be Cormac's favorite pastime. I won't say it's your favorite subject, but it might be your favorite pastime, Cormac. Am I close here?
It might be.
I mean,
I have a strange addiction to them. But
how many CEs per week are you averaging? Let's just call it averaging.
I just sat in on one today about 2-hour rated ductwork and stuff. So do you not all find that riveting?
Yeah. Is there like a profit sharing where you could share some of those with me so that
that's what I'm asking.
It's funny is that what is it? AIA only requires 18 per year with HSWs, and my states, both Florida and Maryland, require 24. And Florida has the caveat of having an advanced code that you have to do, and I'm well over this. I think probably about like March, I was at 24.
Nice.
So yeah, that's something's wrong with me.
Something is wrong.
Yeah, I think Virginia's every 2 years. I need 16, something like that.
Yeah,
it's not too bad actually.
That seems reasonable. And so let's just kind of take a step back and frame this conversation around continuing education and the life of an architect. And basically what this is, if you decide to get registered or licensed, depending on the state, right, you do need to fulfill continuing education requirements. Kevin, do you want to weigh in on just kind of the overall, just the framework of this conversation that we want to put out front so people understand what we're talking about and why we're talking about it? Sure.
Yeah. I think for me, so I teach as well as I'm a sole practitioner and I'm a full-time architecture professor, so for me, education is hugely important. It's sort of what I do. But at the same time, I think that it's not this box checking, which is what I end up doing half the time, sort of right before something is due, or my license for Virginia, I think is next year I got to re-up it. So I'll be making sure I get everything squared away. I'm less good about keeping up sometimes with my AIA yearly requirements, and maybe that's an interesting thing to discuss too, is each state requires something. Mm-hmm. If you're in the AIA and you pay dues to the AIA, they require something. There's overlap, but then there's not. If you've got multiple licenses like Cormac signs like you do, then there's this sort of spreadsheet complexity of
totally.
What have I done?
Algorithms. Yeah. We need algorithms for this.
And then at what point does that miss the forest for the trees? Maybe of what could you be learning if you were more focused on expanding your horizons than just on like, oh my God, my spreadsheet says I need 2 more next week. So I think that's maybe a good starting point or a framework. I think for me, I worked for 11 years for a small 7 to 10 person firm. Then I merged in with a bigger firm for 2 years. Now I'm teaching and now I'm a sole practitioner. So for me, actually now getting the CEUs and things, it's pretty hard because vendors don't come to my house with 2-hour rated wall assemblies and sit in my kitchen and give presentations. And, I can count some of the teaching and things that I do here. I routinely give code lectures and those kinds of things to my students. And I'm also sort of in the middle of nowhere away from cities. So sometimes accessing sort of good continuing education. So this like the differing requirements and maybe questions of access are good places to jump off from.
And the even another way to look at it, I think from this conversation, the angle of this would be, is that the difference between using it for career advancement and, strategic outcomes on projects or career things versus it being a chore or something you need to fulfill last minute, right? Because there is a deadline, which everybody knows architects can't do anything without deadlines, right? So these deadlines exist for good reason and they work in that way. And then there's just kind of this component of honor system that goes with it all. I mean, there definitely are like certificates, but then you are required to basically catalog those things and keep them in case, at least in the states where I'm licensed, there's just random audits that happen, and when that happens, like every year, when you send the check in to redo your license to renew it, there's a checkbox that says I have completed the requirements, and so you agree and you're basically signing your life away at that point, saying, yeah, honor system, I've done this, but then they could audit you, and then you would have to show that you actually did that every time. So, and I'm very much in the camp, I'll just say it, of last minute, like I'm on the chore side. Cormac is way more forward thinking when he's doing his, or he's just addicted to it. He's not actually.
Well,
he's not,
I can I can
yourself.
Honestly explain to you why I actually do what I do and why I do it is because. So I work for a larger firm, and have for really since I stopped being a sole practitioner in 2008, when, everybody in 2008 were sort of kicked in the hindquarters, as we would say. And so one of the things that I did was kind of evolve into being a technical resource for firms, specifically projects, being project architect, senior project architect, project manager. And because of the way that this particular firm that I work for, and I've been, working for now the past 10 years, we're part of, we've developed this thing called the Technical Excellence Group. And one of the things that we do is essentially try to maintain document standards, detail standards, and things like that throughout the firm. And with that, one of the things that we try to do is stay on top of design trends, material trends, manufacturing trends, detailing trends, things like that, that basically we can use to implement as something that helps support our design proficiency. And honestly, a lot of that is more geared towards that. Not everybody wants to just jump on an hour long lunch and learn that was teaching about the fire, the fire rating of, like today, I sat on a fire rating thing for ductwork and how that you could minimize the shaft sizes by using, rated ducts and things like that. And we do that because we want to talk about getting the design benefit, how much square footage can we get back by reducing the amount of shaft wall and spaces and stuff that we would normally do in a traditional method. And it's things like that. And that's really honestly one of the reasons why I do it the way that I do it. There are some that honestly, oddly, I'll say, ooh, that looks interesting. And I will sit in and do those just for fun. But like I said, I do it more for advancement of knowledge so that when somebody in the firm says, hey, I'm trying to do a slab detail up against curtain wall that needs X amount of rating, I'm going to say, I know how to do that. And here's a resource. And we can talk about that and talk about how it affects your design and things like that.
Well, there's some nice knock-on effects from that, right? Is that sort of one person's journey in continuing education, it has a ripple effect in the firm, maybe in the profession. It touches clients, which touches projects, which touches the communities that they sit in, so I think it's, maybe continuing education gets more interesting if it can be framed in a different way, and that's what what we're talking about, right? Is that it's not this oh God, I got to eat my broccoli and take my medicine, that it's
exactly.
There's something else that's this pursuit of knowledge for different reasons. I think, I work on less technically complex projects. I'm more inclined to pull up YouTube and watch a lecture by an architect whose work I really enjoy, as continuing education, even though I don't file it for credits necessarily because I can't really. But, so I'm inclined to sort of be watching, the latest Harvard lecture by someone whose lecture I can't hear in person. Because I really want to be a better designer and to take those things in. So are there these opportunities to diversify the kinds of continuing education? Do they all have to be technological or driven by economies?
Yeah, I honestly, I will try to run the gamut of all sorts of different ones: technical, design oriented, history based, anything that. Now the nerd side of me will seek out the architectural history and the architectural design side of things just because I want to sit and listen to them and learn about things like that. The doing the right thing by my firm is sitting in and learning how I can better improve myself technically so that we can improve our designs both technically and be able to support those designs. If I showed a list of all of my CEUs, and we can even talk about all the different ways that you can kind of track them. You guys were talking about self-reporting, and I'm an AIA member. So most of mine, as I punch them in, they will, send them to me, and it directly reports to AIA. So I don't have to go through that process. But it is funny, as Evan was saying, is doing the honor system of when you are renewing your license at the state level. It so baffles me why we don't just submit our required CEUs so that we don't have to go through the auditing process, which I've been audited by the state of Florida several times.
Oh, really?
Thank you, Florida.
It's random, Cormac. It's random.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You guys talk to a lot of people, is there a sense that, is this driven by individuals? Sort of, Cormac, you're pursuing this, the firm maybe supporting it, or you're creating these instruments within the firm that support the larger group? Or is it, are firms sort of dictating hey, we're going to have a culture of continuing education here? What's the...
So for us, so I work for a firm, Air St. Gross, and commonly referred to as ASG. And we run this thing called the ASG Academy, where we will do everything from having our weekly lunch and learns where anybody can get their CEUs. So at any given time, we're probably averaging about 3 to 4 CEU opportunities per month. Some of those then are also things that we do for ourselves internally, which are things like when we do Green Week, we will internally have our sustainability director talk about different kind of green initiatives, how implementing these green initiatives within the design aspects affect your design and your spec writing and things like that. And then as part of the technical excellence group, we will give lectures or things throughout the firm that talk about proper documentation or proper detailing of certain things, and then have just this constant knowledge share Zoom channel that we have that everybody basically said, hey, Cormac, Evan, Kevin, have you ever worked on a project that had this? And then have that kind of knowledge sharing effort. So we make a very concerted effort to try to do as much internally as the firm to get that, so you don't have to go out and seek it. Then I do the odd thing where if it's say, architectural newspaper or ACE Lab or things like that, those kind of things, I'll do a lot of continuing ed through that. And that's more just me. I mean, when I was an NCARB member, NCARB was a great resource, honestly, for some really good CEUs. And so those were just kind of the things. And the good thing is that unless it's that one paid for the state of Florida, typically that one paid, but it's only because I wait to the last minute to get that one where I have to pay for it, the advanced code. Other than that, most everything that I do is all free. There's just so many different resources out there for CEUs, manufacturers. Spec writing services and stuff do CEUs. There's CEUs that you can find practically anywhere for almost anything. And we were joking earlier before we started the call about Star Wars. If I could find the architecture of Star Wars, I would be doing that.
It's HSW approved.
How to protect your vent shafts.
So I'm curious, just from there's like you just mentioned, Cormac, there's different avenues you can go through to get CEUs. You have a resource available to you once a week. And that one is just, it's on the schedule. Somebody in your firm is doing all of that kind of legwork to schedule and get those different, and they're usually manufacturer driven, I assume, right? As far as who's creating the content. And that's the trade-off, right? They get to get in front of you and tell you about their building components or materials. And in return for that, you're getting an hour of education and probably a free lunch to go with it, right? And then there's the on-demand, which you mentioned, NCARB. There's several different vendors online that offer different on-demand kind of ad hoc stuff. And again, that's usually created by building product manufacturers, right? But there are other sources as well. So let's just talk about the difference. And Kevin, I'd love to hear your perspective on this too, because I think I'm more in a similar boat to you, where when it comes to crunch time for me, I'm going to look for the ones that are interesting to me. Whereas if you're in a firm, you get what you get, right? So there's a little bit of a difference there, because rarely when somebody comes into the firm to do a presentation, does it have anything to do with what you're working on, right? And if you're going out and looking for a CE course that you can apply to your project, that might even be, more useful in the moment. And whereas these other ones, you're kind of, okay, I'm going to file that away for later. But to Cormac's point, like, I think one of the benefits to these about this continuing education thing at all is you are actually learning about things that will be useful, if not on your current project, probably on your next or, not too far distant future project. Because, like, for example, if you've always done rated shafts, back to Cormac's example, and now you can use rated ductwork and actually save size, like, okay, I see the benefit there, right?
Right.
And so
Right.
it's like we don't know these things until we know them, right? And so continuing,
Right.
that's to me the real purpose of continuing education, is to get this broader perspective that may or may not apply to my current project, but I'm going to tend more for looking for stuff that is more applicable to what I'm working on or what is appealing to me versus maybe just what's on the docket. So Kevin, what do you think? Like, where do you fit into that?
I think I'm the same. And maybe you said continuing education. Maybe that's just education, right?
Yeah.
That this idea that can we expand our understanding of things and horizons, and, that maybe education is expansive, that it should be widening the blinders, not narrowing them. But I think, I was similar, when I was in the larger firm, you kind of got what you got, and you got a turkey club on a Wednesday, and it was good. Might have had the cookie, might not have had the cookie. But
I always have the cookie.
Yeah, I have a few too many. I'm cropped, but I've had cookies are my friend. But I think this ability to maybe find more bespoke sort of interest, and also, can it not just be reactive? Can it be proactive? Can you say that's something interesting? I want to go over there, as opposed to, Evan, this is a little bit where you were intimating, right, that this stuff it's going to be useful in some way down the road, but is there a way through, by choosing the options and making it more of an asset, less of the chore, like, can you position yourself in a different way? Just like I in college might have taken an elective, or chosen a second major or done a minor, out of a sense that it might kind of open up some other avenue or some other method of inquiry, or just pad the resume. So I think for me it's this. Education generally, and continuing education for architects, I try to think about it, how can it add to me, help me at the desk? And it might be that that's not necessarily just the technical things. I think seeing an interesting design, or when I worked and lived in Richmond, Virginia for 11 years, sort of between being at Virginia Tech and coming back. And I was part of a group that it started as an idea with the local AIA chapter head, and then a group of us sort of spun it off, and we were, let's say, AIA adjacent. But we were putting on these periodic things. It was really clever. It was called Beer and Design, and it had two things. I'll let you figure out which two things they are. I think I still own
cookies.
Version 2.0 will be cookies and design. That'd be great. Well, what we found, we were able to invite speakers to come. We found a brewery or someone willing to sort of host us and provide the beverages. But we were also drifting into things that were architecture adjacent or not even. Mm-hmm. So you'd get a bunch of designers out, 100 on a Wednesday night, and they would come and hear a tattoo artist and a guy who made a camera out of a van, and nice. Someone who started a community cycling group for underserved community kids, getting them on bikes from the local housing authority projects. So it's, and all the feedback after that from the people that I chatted with and my peers were like, oh, how great was that? It's like we sort of live, eat, drink, and breathe architecture all the time. That, what happens when you introduce something from a new direction? So I think that those sorts of things that jump to my mind of, where you can start to pick and choose, and can you bring in your own agenda as opposed to just kind of what's on the docket, or again, like me cramming, like, I got what is available. Does it cost anything or not? There's a series of really boilerplate metrics that sometimes help me pick, my CEUs. Is it HSW or not? So I think this ability to kind of customize is an interesting way to think about this, that it's less responding to whatever is available or what the immediate needs of my project might be, and that it might position you or the firm or the profession for something large.
There's also, like you mentioned, HSW there. I think it would be good to kind of point out what that means for those who are unlicensed yet. Just I'm sure people have seen that designation, but maybe aren't clear what it means. But there's other ones too. Like Cormac had talked about advanced code for Florida. California has zero net energy requirements as well as accessibility units required, because they further dial in the scope of what is required for renewals, right?
Well, I think you just said, a couple of different things that both California and Florida require. And all of those are HSWs, health, safety, and welfare. And, those are the ones that are primary requirements for us, so that we are staying abreast of all of the latest trends from a code aspect or health aspect, like whether it's different trends in HVAC systems and things like that, and how you design around those that are basically all about the health, safety, and welfare of the users of the buildings that we're designing, right?
Yep.
And then there's just the typical learning units, which, HSWs are, but not all of the learning units are HSWs. Some of them could be just random things like, going to a lecture just recently went to a lecture by Big and University of Michigan, and they had opportunities for learning units, but not HSWs. But, it's still one of those things that you're talking or listening to somebody who's talking about design trends or things like that within the profession and getting credit for them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's like the technical aspect from my point of view. Kevin, what are your thoughts?
I think that's the same. I'm not as familiar with the specialized ones for like Florida and California. Virginia doesn't have any specialized ones, but yeah, I think sort of HSW, health, safety, welfare. And in my experience, I sat on the local AIA board for a number of years and I don't know if you guys have you been on an AIA board or not? Yeah.
Nope.
I have not. No.
Yeah. The joke is the only way off the board is through it, so I moved through, president-elect and all of those things. And I spent a year on the state board, so especially at the local level, we were planning a lot of these things. And I'm not sure all HSWs are created equal. You have to write 4 points. They get reviewed. It's maybe both useful that it's pretty broad, so many things can qualify, that it's not so restrictive that you're getting just like one thing. But also, when it's so broad, what is it being covered? I was just thinking and preparing for this today, wondering about, asking the kind of what if questions. Is like, should there be other frameworks for these things? Should I have to take 3 CDUs, climate disaster units, or, should I have to take accessible, equity-based, justice-based, environmental design kinds of credits? That there's these other, the HSW, so all HSWs are LUs, not all LUs are HSWs.
Yes,
maybe within HSWs, there should be some additional levels of hierarchy that allow people to, again, pick and choose. But then also maybe we'd all be better if we diversified a little bit of what we were getting.
I totally agree with you. I mean, because you're absolutely right. There's some that you're just like, how is this an HSW? And of course, like, we'll actually put in our email blast to people about like these lunch and learns, whether or not they're HSWs or not. And of course, if they are, you'll get a higher turnout rate of people coming because they need them versus like, I don't need any learning units. I need the HSWs,
Mm-hmm.
Give me more of those, give me more, kind of thing.
All 24 that I have to do for Oregon are HSW, and then California is like a different set. It's got the Z and E's and the accessibility one. So unfortunately, I'm not going to get that overlap that Kevin mentioned earlier, like where I have, like Cormac. That is one of the things that gets a little harder to track, and maybe with so many learning units, you could talk a little bit about this, and maybe you don't have to track them because AI is tracking them, but one of the things
you can't see it. Sorry. But it's turned up to, I did log into my AIA account to look at all of the different LUs for the year and HSWs for the year. And there's like the different state requirements that, I've, like you said, you get 24 for each of the states. You get, nice little, so I don't know.
So every type counts as a generic learning unit, but like Kevin said, not everyone counts as a designated, like HSW, ZNE, accessibility, etc. So it's something to watch out for. I mean, that's why I think it's worth pointing out, is because it's like, oh, this is a little confusing if you don't really pay attention to the designations each course gets attributed to it, so that you can track these appropriately. Because if you're not paying attention, at the end of the year, you'll have to scramble to figure that out.
Yeah, when we were planning events, for AI Blue Ridge, which is our neck of the woods down here in Southwest Virginia, we'd be pre-pandemic. We were trying to maybe have one Friday a year where you could get 5 or 6 kind of in a day, and we'd tee them all up, and then you'd go through and you have to go in and apply as the host of the event or the person sort of sponsoring the credit to get it approved. So, we were always volunteer-based board scrambling to just get the event going. And then you find out too late that 5 and 1 CEU and 5 HSWs because AI didn't approve something, or you have to rewrite. So there's a lot of behind the scenes on sort of those credits, how they get certified. The programs are good for 2 or 3 years, I think, and then they expire and you have to re-up them again. So if you're hosting those things or you're putting them on, there's a fair bit of kind of behind the scenes to make sure that those things do qualify, that they do achieve people are expecting when they get their HSW or just a regular LU.
Yeah.
Cormac, your little wheel on the AIA app must go around 3 times, or
it's like the rings on an Apple Watch. Yeah, it's like they're tracking your steps for the day.
I've done my I've done my full steps for the year and then some. And I was looking at just some of the actual transcripts of some of the courses that I have taken, and most of these are basically, as Evan kind of pointed out, somewhat manufactured base. There are a few design ones, but I mean, there are things that are strictly things about code or lead or things like that, in my opinion, I think because of the way that we should be designing for best practices and stuff, that a lot of this, especially for AIA, should be more geared towards kind of understanding best practices for a variety of different things, and not necessarily be just, AIA brought to you by whatever, insert whatever manufacturer, but actually teaching us how to design responsibly, design to code, design universally through universal design and all of these other things. And because Kevin, I think I was liking where you were going with it. It's just there should be these little subsets of okay, you can get all of these HSWs. However, they need to fit these certain little things, kind of like how we do, the way that we acquire hours for the ARE when we're acquiring AXP hours. Yeah. And there's a certain level of ones that you should do, that you should sort of keep refreshing yourselves on that throughout your career, that for some reason we just kind of, it's I could go through, to AIA Florida and sit through a 2-day course where I have it up on one screen, put it on mute and sit there and do whatever it is that you do. I'm not saying I do. Trust me.
You don't. Yeah.
I don't. I weirdly listen to them actually, but it is one of those things, you as a professor, you teach certain things, certain basic knowledge for architects. It's one of those things that you should sort of refresh every so often, that those CEUs should be almost required. And I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but it's just one of those, wouldn't it be better if the CEUs actually meant something other than box checking?
Well, I think one of the huge benefits of manufacturer-based CEUs is that those manufacturers know more about their world than I ever will.
Absolutely.
Right. So that's what I'm hoping, at least. Right. And to me, the opportunity there is to get up to speed on a subject that I can get in that short period of time, more so than I can do anywhere else, right? That is, to me, the ideal situation, is just establish a personal relationship with the person delivering the course, so that, and I say personal for the reason I'm about to get to, not this one. The first one is just tell me what I need to know about your, what innovation is there? What could I be doing better? What are the best practices? What do I need to know at the basic level? But then I have a connection with a real person that I can call when I actually need to apply it to a real project. So I feel like there's really two potential, the right fit at the, it's usually not the right fit at the right time, but it could be the right fit creating a relationship for somebody for when it is the right time, I can leverage that.
Totally agree with you. Because I mean, one of the things is just like, what are the opportunities for influencing your design through the products that they're wanting to come and show you and talk about, and how it affects code and how it affects your design and things like that. And again, you're right. It may not affect it at the time, but it could be something that you just keep in your mental Rolodex of like, oh, I remember that this manufacturer has a solution that's similar to what I'm looking for. And now I've got that point of contact where I can go and utilize them as the subject matter expert for X, Y, or Z of what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, because things are changing all the time, and I can't keep track of all the changes in all the subjects. And so I actually will rely on them to do that because that's their thing, right? So that's the benefit in the relationship there for that to happen.
So I have to say that one of the reasons why the weird addiction of the CEUs happened was I remember writing a set of specs, and I based it off of, because it was kind of some of the first specs that I had to write for large scale projects like this, and listen to people who basically say, oh, you know, this project's very similar to this project, so why don't you just use that set of specs and just, you know, kind of like change the header and footer and all of that other stuff. So sadly, I will admit to it that I did. And we submitted the document, started to get bid RFIs back. The bidders were saying, hey, the spec is outdated. This manufacturer or this product are no longer in use or no longer in business. What do you want to do? And then I had to go back through and start scurrying around to find other products that fit the same design, or sacrifice design through just finding that second or third option or the approved equal, right, for something. And it ended up being that without having that basic working knowledge of like what products are out there, when you start pulling together specs, you're doing yourself a disservice by not understanding the products that are supporting your design. And so I made a pact with myself that that's not going to happen. I'm not going to, I mean, the egg on my face from that was just like, seriously, I just put out a spec that like not to say half of, but I mean, like people were out of business, and here they are in my spec, or this product is 20 years old and they contains formaldehyde, and you're like, okay, I'm not going to do that again.
Can I do that thing that professors do where we like take the model and we turn it on end, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Is there a downside to, you know, I remember sort of being in the office and sort of, but when I was young, no one explained exactly like this person was coming and I got a free sandwich, and I would listen to the 2-hour rated door thing. And it took me a minute to figure out, like, there was always that disclaimer, you know, of like, this is an approved thing. I'm not talking about my products.
Yes. Yeah.
Wink, you know, like this sort of like working the system from both directions. And of course, they are experts. That doesn't mean somebody else wouldn't walk in with a similar product and have a different set of things, you know, so that's this, you know, not to say that I think everyone, I try to operate from a position of generosity that everyone's, you know, doing the right thing and are good people, you know, but this, you know, that they are there to try to get their product into the spec book, right?
Sure.
You know, and I guess that we agree to play the game. You know, it's like, because I want to stay up to date, because I'm not an expert on masonry wall systems as much as I would like to think I am. Right.
Ideally, that person is well versed in their product category. I wouldn't even say product, right? Like,
that's fair.
Right. I think that makes more sense, right? Because then it's less biased, and it's like, well, we don't make the best product for every scenario. We make the best products for these scenarios, and that company makes the best product. You should talk to them. That's what I actually want to get out of a product expert. Right, is I just want the right information, because it's not always applicable to what I'm doing, but I still want you to be the go-to person, right? Because we have a connection. So I'm curious, like something that you said, both of you have kind of alluded to, kind of like this, like, okay, Cormac, you're letting it run 2 hours on the screen on mute while you're doing something else. Not that you would do that, right? And then, but there's definitely like the way that the materials get delivered. So there's live in person. There's on the computer, which is more kind of like, you know, you read a PowerPoint and then you take a test, kind of a thing. Okay, so let's talk about the good delivery. Like, what have been your favorite styles of course delivery, and why?
I'm going to let Kevin go first.
I was going to say the opposite. Yeah, you first. I mean, I think in person, maybe just because we're always more engaged in an in-person. I think we all learned this during the pandemic on Zoom. I saw this with my students. They didn't learn as well. I didn't teach as well. Communicating with clients is often less effective. So I would say partly because you get to develop that sort of like that Evan, you talked about this sort of personal relationship, not that you're going and drinking beers and shooting pool with people, but you start to develop a rapport.
Right.
I think the PowerPoint ones where you sort of click through and then you take the test are the least effective. I think the ones where there's a video-based content of a presentation or, kind of I guess the Amber Book model of sort of a set of video-based animated kinds of content, those things that are more engaging for those. We are all visual generally. I think I'd rather look at a good, beautiful diagram and drawing than read a wall of text on a slide. So I think for me, those, the sort of wall of text is least good, in person pretty good. And then, the various sort of video and animation and it's the ones that are more like storytelling and less like kind of delivering of boilerplate information.
I'd say the same, that always the in-person is, in my opinion, the best approach. One, you're going to have somebody who's there looking you eye to eye and you're engaging in more of a conversation about what they're there to talk about. Then they'll also bring materials and you can actually like get your hands on it and pass it around the room and people talk about it. And then what we tend to do is we actually start having, and again, we had it today in this one, I was on Zoom and the presenter was in person in our office and the conference room was filled with people and they were talking and engaging and they were talking about how we've used these products or how we could use these products within our design. And it more is based off of how would we do something that affects us, that affects our designs, that affects our buildings. And so those to me are always better because, here's somebody on the fly talking about, you could do this or you could do that, or look at this material and how thin it is versus like your conventional shaft wall system or something like that. And makes a real impact because you do have like stuff to pick up and hold in your hands and pass around. The most effective presentations, usually have like models and stuff in them, right? Where, people can kind of get down and start looking at things and turn it upside down and turn around and say, okay, now I'm understanding
with the
this
key,
little,
right?
Exactly. or turn it upside down and say, doesn't that look better?
Well, I agree with the in-person thing, but what's the number of firms that are like small firms or that don't have continuing education product manufacturers coming to their door, like Kevin alluded to early on in the conversation? Like you just don't have access to that resource. So I think this is a little bit of advice giving too, to the product manufacturers who are creating this coursework that goes online. Like we are not as interested in checkbox based. And so Kevin, you talked about Amber Book's offering that's coming out with their continuing education approach. And they want it to be really practical for people. They want it to be actionable. They want it to be potentially career shifting. That's another question. If you guys have ever had kind of a course that has shifted your career in any way, we can talk about that maybe in a minute. But this idea of content delivery, I think visual is super key. Interactive and engaging is key. My favorite part of live stuff is the question and answer period at the end, because that's when the real practical stuff comes out, or it's like, well, I'm using your stuff has never done this, and they can correct them and say, well, we've advanced, or, there's so much opportunity for a real conversation that is the benefit of being in person in a larger office setting, right? Where we learn through osmosis of what challenges are other people coming up with that will deal with this assembly or this system or whatever. And I can learn through that challenge that they're having that I don't even have, right? So I agree, like in-person's awesome, and yet there's so much that we can't do it like that. So the advice here, I think, is valid, though, to the people creating the courses. Like we're not interested in slide-based presentations with little quizzes at the end as much as we are engaging real-world practical stuff, but also some kind of tangible. I don't know how that works, but it seems like there's some innovation that could happen here.
Yeah, I think I'm down here in Southwest Virginia, and the AI chapter I was representing a few years ago, we had the largest geographic area, but the smallest number of members. So we covered, I don't know, a third to a half of the state, from Lexington all the way down to Tennessee, to the coal fields. We had maybe 225 members. Compare that to Northern Virginia, Richmond, Hampton Roads, where they had hundreds and hundreds in that very compact geographic area. So one of the struggles we had as a local chapter trying to deliver, continuing education and just events to our membership was if I can't get them to drive to Roanoke, it doesn't work, right? And I'm 40 minutes from Roanoke. Roanoke's sort of the city where there was a little cluster, so we had routinely sort of members who, they couldn't come to events, they weren't able to, then the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden we were able to share some things in a different way. So I think there was some good things that have come out, and we're all more savvy with these platforms now than we were maybe 5 years ago. But I think for practitioners who are solo or small group, small firm, if you're not in a big city, Cormac, you're in Detroit, right? Is that
yes?
And Evan, I'm not sure.
I'm in Southern Oregon, and I'll just say, like in the last 2 years, there have been 2 in-person lunch and learns.
Yeah, so I think this, the ability of interesting, innovative content to get delivered, sort of to your fingertips and to our these things, our pocket computers, and but in a way that's engaging and that maybe where we have a sense of agency and what we're, that I can pick and choose those things that I think might benefit me or the firm or that project I'm working on, or might help me veer in another direction in my career. I see a lot of students who, Virginia Tech's a huge program, one of the biggest in the country. We've got, 700 undergrads and a 5-year bachelor's or something like that.
Never heard of them.
Yeah. I should say I'm not the Kevin Jones, the famous football player, obviously. Those who might know Virginia Tech, sort of that's not me. He and I know each other, but yeah, I had to clarify that when I first came back to teach here. Like, I am not the football player.
You had a bunch of people signing up for your class, and
yeah.
Like, no, not that guy.
Yeah.
Oh man,
whoops. Yeah, swinging
Sorry.
a miss. Yeah, it hasn't gotten me free dinner reservations or anything yet. So yeah, I was going to say sort of all these students, in any given class of 20 in my design lab, there's 2 or 3 really passionate, sharp designers, 2 or 3 who perhaps could have considered another major 3 years before they get to me. I teach in the 4th year. I teach the more technically oriented class in the 4th and 5th year. They might have gotten some advice in 2nd year to go someplace where they'd be happier. And there's a whole bunch in the middle that are like looking for how they fit into the profession, and I also teach professional practice where we actually get to talk about like, hey, there's designers, but there's like 1,000 other things you might do. So I think this ability to use continuing education, like to design your career, to really think strategically about those things that you might be interested in, or if you just want to make a hard pivot, as a way to try something out, I think those are sort of opportunities that are maybe it's latent and it's there. If it could be capitalized or expanded, that would be, I know I'd be happier. So the choice is in front of me.
It's interesting you say that, because even through CEUs, and the more and more I engage with manufacturers and stuff, the more and more they actually engage and want architects to work for them. Like, how do you use this system, or how would this system best benefit the practice or the building industry or things like that? And it's very interesting that I know a lot of architects who actually work on the manufacturer side of things, whether it's through on their technical side or, sales and kind of like expertise side of things. And it's kind of interesting that CEUs could lead people to, my passion is this, and tell me more about this, and then actually have other avenues of the profession that they could go to. As is funny enough, I actually know a really good friend of mine who I've seen a couple of times at the AIA National, that, he was an architect, and then he decided to pursue the manufacturer side of things, and how he's bridging the gap between manufacturers and the profession. And it was all through basically sitting through and engaging with their local rep for, a particular product, that then, because he became kind of like the subject matter expert within his office of utilizing these types of systems, that he ended up going and working for the company that had come in and given him the turkey sandwich and the cookie. Yeah.
And I think so I got my MArch degree in 2004, and then the Great Recession hit, 3 or 4 years in as a practitioner. So there's this sort of me in this kind of middle generation, right? Of, where a bunch of us left. Those of us who stayed are, well, I'm teaching now, but or maybe there's a demand because you're kind of have this missing middle, but then you also have these equitable access to the profession, for people of color, for sort of different gender identities and things, like in what ways might, could continuing education evolve to make those things more open, to make them more like, if you're stuck, can you get unstuck by chasing, sort of a new career path? Again, I'm back to a little bit of wondering of beyond HSW, I think we need to innovate practice if we're going to tackle climate change, not just projects. So it's like, should there be practice, innovating practice learning units? Should there be, these other, again, back to these other categories that I know as a sole practitioner, I would love to go sort of like, this is where podcasts are great, and Entre Architect, and all there is this network, of people who identified this need, especially sort of in 2007, 8, 9, for sort of sharing of knowledge in different ways. So I think I don't know. I wonder if we cast the net too narrowly sometimes when we're talking about continuing education.
Well, and we're not driving it, right? It's coming to us from other places, right? And there's reasons why. Like, there's a whole business model behind that too.
There's a lot of acronyms in architecture.
There are.
In our profession, there's a lot of them.
There are a lot of them. but like that whole idea of like where they're coming from is like we're an audience of consumers for that. We're not producing that content a lot of the time. And back to Cormac's point, where the manufacturers want to hire architects who know how to speak the language of architects, know how to speak the language of design, assemblies, diagrams, like the way that you can communicate a complex system in a more easy to understand way because of the kinds of communication and project challenge styles that you've been trained to overcome. I think all of that stuff's super valid, Kevin. So to your point, like we should have kind of a brainstorming session. And I think that this is kind of where architects do have other avenues to pursue to do good for the entire profession at a profession level, working on the profession rather than working in the profession kind of a scenario. There's a lot of potential there for people to consider.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And Kevin, you were alluding to the fact that it could be used as a platform, because I know that podcasting, and you said Entre Architect and things like that, are kind of like these places for inspiration. We need to use that more for how we kind of do this practical changes. I know that Entre Architect just had their annual conference, and not talk too much about it, but it is a place where sole practitioners or small firm people come together and they talk about innovations and how that they can change their aspect of the profession, and utilizing things like continuing education to better practice are some of those, and they gear that towards that. I think in the way that AIA may do it a little bit differently, because it is more like they don't have the mechanism to create a lot of the continuing education, but the continuing education is coming to them and we're like, okay, well, that's great, that's interesting, we'll go ahead and certify that so that our members can benefit from this HSW or whatever it is, but it doesn't lend itself towards the innovation side of things. Agreed. It only lends itself towards, like, again, as we said, started from the beginning, the box check.
Yeah, it's really reactive, right? I mean,
yes.
Like, can you ever innovate or be ahead of something if you're always reacting, not being proactive? And like with AIA certifies things, right? And I sometimes think that you get this for whom by whom, like, you decided that these are the things. Everybody has a framework by which they operate. A big institution like that, also does. And I think this space sort of that you guys are in, and I know Aaron Pellegrino at Out of Architecture. Like, there are some interesting, like, people challenging things, so it's like, can continuing education be a disruptor in that way? I think the disruptor's a 10-year-old term, but are there ways to just frame it differently? I think is that there's opportunities there to deliver different kinds of content, to deliver content different ways, to reach different audiences for different purposes. I think anything that's not back to moving beyond box checking, but it's like maybe it's a little bit of a challenge to sort of the allied and the acronyms and the AIA and those things to like, don't be too comfortable.
I always go back to things that Evan talks about with his other podcasts. He talks to the innovators that affect our industry that saw no real innovation in the industry. So they had to go the adjacent side of things to affect change within our industry. And I think, the use of these tools of continuing education and the way that you use them, the way that, again, kind of like back to the idealized way that you could use CEUs could be that it helps drive innovation of all sorts of different kinds within the profession rather than kind of adjacent to it, like Aaron and other people who are trying to disrupt things from the outside because the inside doesn't seem too eager to change.
Well, yeah, they're not satisfied, right? I think that there's obviously a few different attitudes in the industry. There's those who want to keep doing things the way they've always been doing them. You would just call that the status quo, and it's just the machine keeps moving. And then there's others who are never satisfied, right? Truly.
Right.
It could be a project. It could be the profession. It could be leadership. It could be a number of things. And those are the ones who are really pushing those, trying to, make those things better over time, for sure.
Right.
I do think there's an opportunity here. I'm curious if you guys have seen this kind of play out in your firms that you've worked for or on projects that you've done where learning like this kind of CE paradigm has contributed to, let's just call it like your expertise, either, amongst a group of colleagues or whatever, to that you've been able to leverage in that way to just be a better architect, but also like a mentor and a leader in your firm?
I've honestly learned, through the experience of doing a lot of different adaptive reuse and large scale renovation projects and things like that. A lot of what I do when I seek out CEUs are things that kind of help improve my understanding, knowledge, trends, and things like that in adaptive reuse, so that I can be that resource. Because a lot of times, and, funny to say, even some of our basic tools like Bluebeam are putting out white papers, or they call it a blue paper, on trends in adaptive reuse. And these are the things, this is interesting. And so they're talking about all of these different things. And so I've learned a lot through kind of outside forces, as well as pairing it up with kind of like my own practical experience on how I can continuously improve when we go after these adaptive reuse projects. And so I don't call myself an expert in it. I've done a lot, and they could technically consider me one, but it's more of just, I feel like where my expertise in that is I know where to go. I know what to ask. And and if I don't know it, I know where to go. And it's through a lot of these.
Yeah,
exactly.
Right.
And it's through a lot of these like CEUs that I've done where, I'm learning how to use the systems and the design trends and things like that as part of this, what is now becoming kind of more of like my passion side of like projects I would love to work on.
Yeah, it's great. Most of my 20-year career has been adaptive reuse, so tax credits and, how to make something thin when it needs to be thick, but it needs to look thin. Those kinds of things. And I think for me, maybe two examples come to mind, Evan. The firm I worked for, the small boutique firm, they were really engaged in the local community, sort of doing projects that were architecture, but everyone sat on boards. So there's a little bit of the kind of culture of the civic sort of citizen architect mentality in the firm I worked for. And I think I was predisposed to that a little and chose to work there, partly because I felt that authenticity and alignment, but then, got the bug and teach an integrated design lab here in Blacksburg. The kick the tires, it's got to be plausible kind of building. Mm-hmm. One semester, but, also do the other semester I teach a community-based design lab where we go out and work in rural Appalachia with communities on real projects. We don't do design build like at Auburn at the Rural Studio, but are sort of doing, I know. I mean, they're the one to talk about. I know you have a connection as well, but, know your audience, right? But we're in our second semester sort of working with different community in Appalachia. So for me, when I went to AIA national conventions a few years, when I was sitting on the board, when I go to an NCARB conference, I choose the sessions where I can bolster my knowledge on community-based design practices, engagement strategies, these I don't want to put my foot in my mouth when I walk into a community. And
Right.
I think that it's also, especially when you go in person, I met Rosa Shang at an NCARB conference. We had some nice shop talk about some of the issues in the profession. So you start to build a network when you go to these things, especially if you can zero in on those things that you're interested in. So for me, that's one, is just sharpening my pencil on best practices relative to community-based design efforts. And then the second, a couple of years ago, I felt a real deficit when I was working with my students on, I'm going to say broadly, sustainability. I know that's a loaded word and it means 1,000 things to 1,000 people.
Right.
But I felt that partly because I hadn't done a ton of new construction, I was doing adaptive reuse. So I was always sort of, working within a very specific slice of questions relative to sort of environmental and energy and resiliency questions. So AI Virginia, they basically used the AI Boston, or the group up there that had 10 hours of embodied carbon. And it started 101. Here's what embodied carbon is. And then there was a session on structures, and a session on systems, and a session on interiors, and a session on products, and then on environmental declarations, and kind of really got into the weed. And AI Virginia sort of put those on. What was interesting was they sort of played the video, which you can find on YouTube. You can go watch them tonight if you want. But then, to supplement it, they did the live in-person Q&A thing, Evan, that you liked, where they sort of played the 40-minute content that had already been made. But then they fielded via Zoom a couple of local experts or people from the region who could then answer questions or speak to the things that have been shared in the video. So that for me has changed some of the ways I talk with the students, and when I critique their work, or when I write a design brief for the studio, because I just taught embodied carbon and played one of their videos in professional practice last week, because
Awesome.
We need to be talking about these things, and they do know what this means. And they're like, kind of, I took EBS, and they sort of understand it, but they haven't had to put it into use yet, but so that was one where I felt a deficit and sort of sought out content, because I wanted to, both in my own work, I do smaller projects, so moving the needle's maybe a little bit smaller, but I wanted to be a little sharper there, sort of working with, 40 kids a year who are going to go out and change the profession. I wanted to make sure that my game was at least up to little, not an expert.
Well, there's
to be a little more fluent.
There's so much content out there, these resources, that you actually can kind of minor or specialize in an area strategically for your own career advancement, but also for the benefit of, you name it, your firm, your studio, your community, whatever it is, to really differentiate you amongst your colleagues or your competition, as it may be, right? So I think that it's a great way, and a lot of times at no cost, right? It does cost time, but it may not cost you money, and you really can set yourself apart in meaningful ways through these resources. I think it's pretty valuable in that way.
Where do you think we're all inundated with information all day long, every day?
Really? I didn't notice.
I don't know if you've heard. Yeah.
I haven't noticed that.
Sorry. I mean, you're just in this black void.
It's just you. Yeah.
So, exactly. I know maybe it doesn't penetrate the void, but so it's, I know sometimes, especially even when I was a junior, young architect, 10 or 15 or now 20, 20 years ago. And, I remember a fellow showed up and he was talking about a product. He was like, this is environmentally friendly. I was like, tell me more. And he goes, well, it's got 2% corn in it. I was like, 2% corn? What does that mean? Basically he's talking about ethanol. Is there a challenge to kind of separating the wheat from the chaff? When there is so much content at your fingertips, like how does one, what are the trusted resources? And I guess the AIA certifying things is a metric that one might use, sort of your firm letting people come and saying, yes, you may come through the door with your sandwiches and your CEUs is another level of taste or of regulation on those things. I could watch any random thing on YouTube.
Right.
So it's like, when there is so much, how do you zero in on the good stuff?
I was going to say it's all based off of what kind of catered lunch they bring, but
that could be it.
Hey, we're bringing Panera. Nah, thanks though.
Yeah, thanks. You and everyone else.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good question. I think there are definitely
really
companies that have basically become catalogs for this information, and then you either like the way that they deliver that content or not, and maybe that's one of the more broad ways to do it. But I think that's tough. I honestly have found that like there's enough pressure on the presenters to deliver something useful that I think the minimum bar is actually pretty decent when it comes to a lot of this stuff. But I don't have the same affliction Cormac does of seeking these out and consuming so many of them. So I'm probably not the right person to ask. But it's kind of, to me, it's kind of like there's certain YouTubers I want to watch, right? Like, and I follow them, and not indifferent from this podcast and the audience of this podcast, right? So to me, it is kind of about the people who are doing it and the ones who are available to field questions and just the vibe that I get with them. I think sometimes that can happen at a brand or a company level, but usually it's going to be at the personal level for me.
Well, we're back to relationships again. Right?
We are. It's real touchy.
A minute ago, we were at ethics, relationships, communication. Yeah, we cover all the
all those matter.
The essential ones.
Yeah.
And those are how you distill some of the things that you pursue as your basis of knowledge, is like, how trustworthy are they? You know, I mean, at the core of things, I mean, you know, is this just, are you here just giving us a sales pitch and sandwiches, or are you actually sharing content that's usable, that we can be the innovators that we want to be with your assistance kind of thing?
That we can rely on. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. I have a kind of a final bonus question here, just to kind of wrap up the conversation. And that is, do you have a favorite CE that you've ever taken, and so what is it and why? I can go first so that you guys don't feel like you're on the spot, because this one's been, and Cormac was there when this happened. It was the Chicago River, the architectural tour, right? Actually got credit for going on a boat tour of architecture in the city of Chicago. It was incredible, and yes, we did. I had to self-report it. I didn't get something in the mail, but it actually is. It is accredited for that. And so obviously, number one, it was experiential and it was interactive, and the docent basically who's on the boat leading it is super knowledgeable about everything that we're seeing. And it's not about a building product. It's not about a product category. It's about architecture. And so kind of going back to early on in the conversation, there's various ways that you can get continuing education. And for this one, for me, was really impactful, because I learned a lot about a city I didn't know a lot about. I learned a lot about the architecture. It was a perfect day. I was on a boat. There were hors d'oeuvres. There was it was great friends. And so that one, it's hard to replicate that for sure. So it was probably an anomaly, but that was my favorite CE that I've ever done. How about you guys? Cormac's looking through his list. I can see him scrolling, and he's basically limited to the last
number
year.
912.
No. So, what I was trying to do is just trying to remind myself on the people who gave this, and I believe it's in, if somebody's listening and they're like, no, that's not our name, you dummy. But it's the Society of Roadside Architecture, I believe is that? What it is, something similar to that. But they gave this amazing interactive online lecture about Googie architecture, and just to learn about it. And then just this guy was sketching and drawing and showing drawings and showing old historic photographs. Again, it's this kind of this journey of how old architecture kind of influenced this Googie architecture, and the whole space race and all of that other stuff, and all of these things that were interesting to me is just the space race and all of that other stuff, but how it influences what I do. I had a blast with that one. It was great. And they opened it up when everybody came on camera, and people were asking questions and all this other stuff. And I, much like me taking my daughter to a Lemonheads concert, was the youngest person on the lecture from most of the people who were there. But it was just really fun. It was kind of really exciting to kind of just sit there and play with all the different knowledge of Googie architecture.
I think for me two maybe come to mind. The first one, Evans, like yours, I took a bunch of students, but we did it through the local AIA chapter. We drove up to Charlottesville about 2 hours on a Friday to tour the biggest mass timber building in Virginia.
Oh, nice.
That was being built a few years ago in downtown. So it was sort of new emerging technology. I wanted to sort of learn more about. There was a lot of our members actually made the trip, so it tells me that it was sort of intriguing and it was something exciting. It got people interested. It was the reason I went and sort of drug some students with me. It was great. It's the nicest smelling job site I've ever been on. It just was like a pine forest. It was, but the contractor was there and the kind of builder owner's rep talked about kind of the why behind the thing, which I think for me, maybe it's the sort of architect brain or professor brain or whatever. It's like, I need to get to the why, here's where we are, but I want to go 3 steps back to get to the core question. So, they did a really good job of explaining, sort of what the goals of the project were and why that material and the advantages and disadvantages. And, I think it was like you said, it was experiential. It was there. The sun was setting. It was a nice day in April, so there were a number of things. Maybe all CEUs should be on a boat with hors d'oeuvres at the sunset.
They should, pine or a cedar scent. Yes.
Yeah. But then the other one, I think at the AI National Conference in New York, which was in 2018, it was at one of the big sort of famous showrooms there, playhouses. And it was can't remember her name, but she was the business director of Bjarke Ingels Group. And she gave she gave a really riveting sort of talk about practice and the ways that their interest in innovative design, that they were sort of out front on innovative design and how they were trying to get their business practices to catch up. So it was. I probably have it written down in a sketchbook.
We actually did.
I was going to say
we did a follow-up episode because we were there as well, and it was an absolutely incredible conversation, talk that she gave. And I think she's the CFO of Bjarke Ingels Group, and just coming at the practice of architecture from that side of it, right? In order to make a sustainable business, was kind of setting that foundation, right? And I agree, that was a great talk. Yeah. It was so good, and I forgot that we got credit for that. But you're right.
Yeah. There you go. My little thing on, and,
right.
I can tell that Cormac is the one, like I go to AI events and I have to dig out my number on my phone to write down my AI number. But I think Cormac, you could probably like rattle yours off.
Right.
Well, so you can't see it, but like right there, I've got like lanyards. All of my lanyards are hanging up right behind my head. I've got tons.
Conference nerd.
Yeah.
Except for one, because I let a friend of the show and just a friend borrow. Remember, we were leaving early from Chicago, right. Evan?
Yep.
And I let somebody borrow so that they could go and listen to the final keynote that we couldn't. And she never returned it.
An incomplete set.
I'm texting her right now.
Maybe all good content is sort of surprising or unexpected or, sort of catches us in some way, that is unexpected or pushes us beyond something. I think the best lectures I go to in a building next door, from visiting architects and scholars and things, are those ones where I walk out with more questions, than I went in with, and because it sticks in the brain, right? Yeah. It sort of stays with you for a while.
Super intriguing.
So maybe that's good content, is if it does that.
Evan and I periodically go to MDC, Monterey Design Conference, and one of the amazing things about that is like the types of lectures that they bring in. And there was one that I don't know what I was really expecting out of this Oklahoma architect, Rand Elliott, but after he was done, I felt like I was leaving a Rocky movie. I was like, let's go punch some architecture. It was just like, that was like the excitement that I'm looking for when I go to these things. And sometimes I'm like sorely disappointed. And sometimes I'm like, yeah, let's go beat something up. Not in the, like, okay, how about let me restate that. Let's go hug some architecture.
Yeah. How about a non-violent outcome? Thank you.
the non-violent solution of appreciating architecture. Sure. Let's do that.
Took an interesting turn.
Yes.
So.
Well, this has been a fun conversation. Continuing education is a double-edged sword. It's one of those things where a lot of people look at it and they're like, oh, I got to do this. And there's other people who are using it to their advantage. Yeah. And so to me, I think that is something that was worth talking about today, because I think we uncovered quite a few things in this conversation that really show that you can take advantage of this stuff to improve all kinds of things in many different ways. And I think there were some tips in here for the people creating the content as well. But a shout out to Amber Book for sponsoring this episode because of their upcoming continuing education offerings. They'll be out soon, so we should hopefully have a link in the show notes for what they're going to be working on. And Kevin, we appreciate you coming on the show to talk about this subject today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's nice to chat with you guys. And I'd be remiss for my students if I didn't sign off the way I sign off all my emails with high fives all around. So
nice.
All right.
High fives all around. Thank you guys.
Nice.
Appreciate it. All right. Cheers.